Complete silence fell over the courtroom. Not a whisper, not a breath, not even the sound of a pen scratching against paper. Judge Robin Tarnowski had just played an audio recording that no one in the room had expected to hear, least of all Sean Diddy Combs himself. The music mogul's face transformed before everyone's eyes, draining of color as his own voice echoed through the courtroom speakers, revealing admissions so disturbing that several jurors physically recoiled in their seats. If you're new to our channel, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more breaking coverage of high-profile cases. We bring you the most detailed and accurate reporting on cases that matter. Nobody anticipated this moment would come today. The room was already tense during what was expected to be routine evidentiary arguments about which recordings would be admissible. Eyes were focused on the legal teams presenting their arguments until the judge unexpectedly announced, "I've reviewed this evidence in chambers and believe the jury needs to hear it in its entirety." Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Even the court stenographer paused. No warning, no preamble, just Judge Tarnowski instructing the court technician to play Exhibit 24B through the courtroom audio system. Until that moment, Diddy had maintained his composure throughout the trial, appearing confident despite the serious charges against him. But something had changed. Maybe it was the realization that the recording existed at all. Maybe it was the shock of hearing the judge determine it was admissible. Maybe it was knowing that his own words were about to contradict everything his defense had argued for weeks. Whatever it was, Diddy was done with his carefully constructed facade. He wasn't sitting there as a celebrity anymore. He was there as a defendant, hearing his own unguarded words, a man watching his freedom potentially slip away with each syllable. And when the recording began to play, the courtroom wasn't prepared for what they would hear. Because what Diddy revealed in that private conversation about his treatment of women, the alleged criminal enterprise, and his belief that he was untouchable, wasn't just incriminating. It was a confession that no legal team, no matter how skilled, could explain away. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with low conversations. The press hunched in their designated rows, and lawyers whispered strategies as they waited for the judge to enter and begin the day's proceedings. But when Judge Tarnowski entered with a noticeably serious expression and immediately called both legal teams to approach the bench, the room changed. You could hear a pin drop. Some people thought it was a procedural issue. Others thought perhaps a juror had reported misconduct. But the way both prosecution and defense attorneys stiffened as they listened to the judge, heads nodding with increasing gravity, told everyone this was something extraordinary. The judge raised a hand to silence the whispers that had begun to rise in the gallery, and Diddy, who'd been casually reviewing documents with his team, suddenly looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. The color didn't drain from his face immediately. That would come later. But his eyes narrowed with what looked like the first flickers of concern. Judge Tarnowski returned to her seat and addressed the courtroom without making eye contact with anyone. She didn't even glance at Diddy, who was now sitting straighter, his casual demeanor replaced with visible attentiveness. During the discovery process, the prosecution provided multiple audio recordings to the court. Judge Tarnowski began. After careful review and consideration of the objections from defense counsel, I have determined that Exhibit 24B is both relevant and admissible under federal evidence rules, despite defense objections regarding its provenance. The judge allowed no interruption, and from that moment on, the entire trial shifted because what was about to play wasn't speculative evidence or second-hand testimony. It was Diddy's own voice in what he clearly believed was a private conversation. Diddy's lead attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, we renew our objection to this recording." It was obtained without my client's knowledge or consent, and the defense has serious concerns about potential editing or—" The judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Counsel, we've addressed these objections extensively in chambers. The recording has been authenticated by 3 independent audio forensic experts who confirmed it has not been edited, spliced, or altered in any way. The ruling stands. The jury will hear the recording in its entirety." The courtroom was absolutely silent as the court technician prepared the audio system. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised over notepads. Diddy's family members in the gallery exchanged worried glances. The prosecution team sat perfectly still, their expressions carefully neutral. Diddy whispered urgently to his attorney, who placed a restraining hand on his arm, shaking his head slightly as if to say, "There's nothing we can do." Judge Tarnowski addressed the jury directly. "You are about to hear an audio recording that was made on September 3, 2019, at a private residence in Los Angeles. You will hear the voice of the defendant, Sean Combs, in conversation with another individual whose identity is known to the court. I remind you to consider this evidence in the context of all testimony you have heard thus far." She nodded to the technician. "Proceed." The speakers crackled briefly, and then Diddy's voice filled the courtroom, relaxed, unguarded, and about to change everything. The recording began with casual conversation, the clink of ice in glasses, music playing softly in the background. The setting was clearly social, comfortable. Diddy's voice was relaxed, laughing about something inconsequential. The other voice, male, slightly deeper, responded with equal casualness. They discussed an industry event, a mutual acquaintance, ordinary topics that gave no hint of what was to come. But approximately 3 minutes into the recording, the conversation shifted. The other man asked, "What about that situation with the girl from the party? Is that handled?" There was a pause, the sound of a drink being poured, and then Diddy's voice returned, noticeably more guarded, but still confident. "Always handled. That's why I have a system. That's why I pay people what I pay them," the other voice pressed. "But she was talking about going to the press, man." "That's different." "Talking is different than doing," Diddy replied, his tone dismissive. "They all talk at first. Then they remember how this town works. They remember who their friends are, who gets them jobs, who can make sure they never work. Again, it's business." As the recording continued, Diddy became more expansive, more explicit in his descriptions. He outlined what he called his infrastructure, a network of employees, associates, and industry connections who helped manage these situations as they arose. "Look, you've been to the parties," Diddy's voice continued. "You've seen how it works. Phones checked at the door. NDAs before anyone even gets in the car to come over. The right substances to make people more flexible. It's not random. It's a system that works." The other voice sounded more hesitant now. "But some of these girls, man, they seem really messed up after. That one model was in the hospital. And who paid that hospital bill?" Diddy shot back. "Who made sure there was no police report? Who got her a campaign with that French designer 3 months later? She's fine. They're all fine. They get what they want. I get what I want. The ones who understand the game move up. The ones who don't. In the courtroom, the jury listened with expressions ranging from disgust to shock. Several made extensive notes. One older woman on the jury appeared to be fighting tears. Diddy sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, his attorney's hand now resting on his shoulder in what appeared to be both restraint and support. The recording continued, with Diddy describing specific events that matched testimony. The jury had already heard from alleged victims. Only from his perspective, they weren't victims at all. They were willing participants in a transactional relationship that benefited everyone involved. The problem is when they forget what they signed up for, his voice explained. When they forget who made them. I take some nobody from nowhere, put them in the right rooms, get them the right contracts, and suddenly they think they made themselves. They forget who has the power. The other voice objected. But some of this stuff, man, it's crossing lines. That girl didn't agree to. Diddy cut him off. She agreed the moment she took the first gift, the first trip, the first opportunity. That's the agreement. Everything after that is just details. As the recording played on, Diddy could be heard becoming increasingly candid about methods of control, about how he ensured silence, about what happened to people who forgot the rules. He mentioned specific names, names that had appeared in testimony throughout the trial, and described incidents that prosecutors had already presented evidence about, only now confirmed in Diddy's own words. The most damning segment came approximately 15 minutes into the recording, when Diddy addressed the issue of consent directly. Consent is a contract, his voice stated matter-of-factly. And like any contract, it has terms. You provide certain things, I provide certain things. The problem isn't that anyone's being forced. The problem is that some people want to renegotiate after they've already taken what I'm offering. That's not how it works. The other voice, sounding increasingly uncomfortable, said, "But some of these girls say they were drugged, that they couldn't even consent." There was a pause, the sound of a glass being set down heavily. And then Diddy's voice, lower now, with an edge that hadn't been present before. "And who's going to believe them? Their word against mine? Their word against an entire system built to protect me? I've spent decades making sure that can't happen." In the courtroom, one of the prosecutors closed her eyes briefly, as if the confirmation of what they had alleged was almost too much to bear. Diddy's lead attorney was writing furiously, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his colleagues, clearly preparing objections or strategies to mitigate the damage being done. Judge Tarnowski watched the jury carefully, noting their reactions. The recording continued, with Diddy explaining how allegations were handled, how potential witnesses were either paid off or discredited, how evidence was controlled or destroyed. "It's not about whether something happened or didn't happen," his voice explained. "It's about making sure there's no proof, no credible witness, no scenario where it's their word against mine, because I've already won that fight before it starts." As the recording neared its conclusion, the other voice asked one final question. "But aren't you worried? With all the Me Too stuff, people are taking these accusations more seriously now." Diddy laughed, a sound that echoed chillingly through the courtroom. "That's for people who don't have real power. I've got senators in my contacts. I've got police chiefs at my parties. I've been building this network for 30 years. I'm not worried about some movement on Twitter." The recording ended with the sound of glasses clinking. A toast to being untouchable, Diddy's voice said, without a trace of doubt or concern. When the audio finally stopped, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one moved. It was as if the air itself had been sucked from the room, leaving a vacuum that no one knew how to fill. Judge Tarnowski finally broke the silence. The record will reflect that Exhibit 24B has been played in its entirety for the jury. She turned to Diddy's attorney. "Does the defense wish to make a statement regarding this evidence?" The attorney stood, visibly shaken despite his professional demeanor. "Yes, Your Honor. We request a brief recess to confer with our client." The judge nodded. "The court will recess for 30 minutes. She looked at the jury. "Members of the jury, you are instructed not to discuss this recording or any other evidence during the recess. As the jury filed out, many avoided looking in Diddy's direction. The gallery erupted in whispers as soon as the judge left the bench, and Diddy, for the first time since the trial began, looked truly afraid. When court reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Diddy had composed himself somewhat, but the confident demeanor that had characterized his courthouse appearances was gone. His legal team, huddled around him at the defense table, appeared to be in crisis mode, passing notes and whispering urgently. The prosecution team, by contrast, sat quietly, their case suddenly bolstered beyond what they could have hoped for. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Johnson, waited calmly for proceedings to resume. Judge Tarnowski returned and addressed the court. Before we continue, I want to provide some context for the recording the jury has just heard. This evidence was provided to the prosecution by a confidential informant who was present at the conversation. The recording was made legally under California's one-party consent law, as the person recording was a participant in the conversation. She continued, "The defense has challenged the admissibility of this recording on several grounds, all of which have been considered and rejected by this court. The recording has been authenticated by expert analysis, and its probative value substantially outweighs any prejudicial effect, particularly given its direct relevance to the charges of racketeering and sex trafficking." The judge then turned to the prosecution. "The government may proceed with its questioning of the next witness." Johnson stood. "Your Honor, in light of the recording just played for the jury, the government calls Special Agent Marcus Rivera of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Rivera, a serious man in his late 40s with close-cropped hair and an immaculate suit, took the stand and was sworn in. After establishing his credentials and experience investigating organized crime and human trafficking, the prosecutor got straight to the point. Agent Rivera, were you involved in the investigation that led to the recovery of the recording we just heard?" "Yes, I was," Rivera confirmed. "I was the case agent assigned to the investigation of Mr. Combs' beginning in early 2020. Can you explain to the jury how this recording came into the possession of the FBI?" Rivera nodded. "In December of 2019, an individual contacted our office with information regarding alleged criminal activity by Mr. Combs. This individual, who had been part of Mr. Combs's inner circle for several years, was concerned about behavior they had witnessed and participated in. They provided initial information and, after being vetted as a reliable source, agreed to become a confidential informant." "Was this person the one who made the recording we just heard?" "Yes. After agreeing to cooperate with our investigation, they informed us of this recording, which they had made several months earlier as a form of personal insurance. They were concerned about potential retaliation if Mr. Combs ever discovered they were questioning his activities." The prosecutor approached with a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this FBI memorandum as Exhibit 25. After the document was admitted, Johnson continued, "Agent Rivera, this memorandum details the initial interview with the confidential informant. Can you tell the jury what specific concerns this person raised?" The informant described what they characterized as a system or operation led by Mr. Combs that identified, recruited, and exploited young women, particularly those trying to break into the entertainment industry. They described methods of control including drugs, intimidation, financial inducements, and blackmail. They were particularly concerned about the use of date rape drugs at private events and the filming of compromising situations without consent. In the gallery, several journalists were typing frantically on their laptops. Diddy's family members, who were present, appeared stunned, some wiping away tears. Diddy himself maintained a rigid posture, his jaw visibly clenched. The prosecutor continued, "After receiving this recording, What steps did the FBI take to verify its authenticity? We sent it to our forensic audio laboratory for analysis. They confirmed several things. First, that the recording had not been edited or altered in any way. Second, that the voices could be positively identified as belonging to Mr. Combs and the informant. And third, that background noise and acoustic characteristics matched the location where it was allegedly recorded. And did this recording form the basis for further investigation? It was one element of a broader investigation, but yes, it provided specific leads that we pursued. Names mentioned in the recording were interviewed. Financial records referenced were subpoenaed. Security personnel mentioned were questioned. The recording essentially provided a roadmap for investigating aspects of the alleged criminal enterprise. The prosecutor displayed a chart on the courtroom screens. Agent Rivera, can you explain this organizational chart to the jury? Rivera pointed to the chart, which showed Diddy at the top of a complex network of associates, employees, and facilitators. Based on our investigation, including information from multiple witnesses and informants, this chart represents the structure of what we believe was a criminal enterprise operated by Mr. Combs. At the top, Mr. Combs directed all activities. Below him were trusted lieutenants who carried out his instructions and insulated him from direct involvement in many of the most explicit criminal acts. He continued, describing layers of the organization, security personnel who controlled access and prevented victims from leaving, medical professionals who provided prescription drugs, fixers who handled payoffs and threats, lawyers who crafted NDAs and settlement agreements, and at the bottom, the victims themselves. What we found particularly notable, Rivera explained, was how compartmentalized the operation was. Many individuals involved only knew their specific role, not the full scope of activities. This is a common technique in organized crime, ensuring that no single person other than the leader understands the entire operation. As the agent continued his testimony, he corroborated specific statements from the recording with evidence gathered during the investigation. Financial records showing payments to women who had alleged abuse, but suddenly recanted. Text messages instructing security to prevent specific individuals from leaving events. Medical records of women who had been hospitalized after attending Diddy's parties. The most devastating testimony came when Rivera explained how the recording aligned with victim statements that had previously been challenged by the defense as lacking corroboration. One victim testified earlier in this trial that she was told, "Consent is a contract," when she objected to sexual activities at a party in 2018. The defense suggested she had fabricated this distinctive phrase. As the jury just heard, Mr. Combs used that exact phrase in the recording, suggesting this was terminology he commonly employed. Throughout this testimony, Diddy appeared increasingly agitated. He whispered urgently to his attorneys, who struggled to calm him. When Rivera began connecting specific statements from the recording to testimony from alleged victims, Diddy abruptly stood up. "This is all lies," he shouted, before his attorneys could stop him. "That recording is taken completely out of context." Judge Tarnowski immediately banged her gavel. "Mr. Combs, sit down immediately. You are not permitted to speak in this court except through your attorneys, or if you take the witness stand." As security officers moved closer to the defense table, Diddy's lead attorney placed a hand on his client's arm. "Sean, please, this isn't helping." The outburst hung in the air as Diddy slowly returned to his seat, the damage to his credibility with the jury already done. Judge Tarnowski addressed the jury. "You will disregard the defendant's outburst. It is not evidence in this case." But the expressions on the jurors' faces suggested the outburst, combined with the recording and Agent Rivera's testimony, had made a profound impression. Several looked directly at Diddy for the first time, their expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. As testimony continued, the prosecution methodically connected the dots between the recording, the FBI investigation, and the testimony of numerous alleged victims, creating a comprehensive picture of what they characterized as a criminal enterprise dedicated to exploiting vulnerable women for decades. By the time Agent Rivera stepped down from the witness stand, the defense's strategy of portraying the allegations as fabrications motivated by financial gain lay in ruins. Diddy's own words had confirmed what the prosecution had been arguing all along, that this wasn't about isolated incidents or misunderstandings, but about a systematic operation built to facilitate abuse and ensure silence. Following Agent Rivera's testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an expert in trauma psychology and coercive control. Dr. Montgomery, a distinguished woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and clear, direct speech, took the stand with the confidence of someone who had testified in hundreds of cases. After establishing her credentials, including decades of work with victims of trafficking and abuse, the prosecutor asked her to explain the significance of the recorded conversation in the context of coercive control. What we heard in that recording, Dr. Montgomery explained, was a textbook description of a control system. Mr. Combs described multiple overlapping methods of ensuring compliance and silence: financial control, career opportunities, threats, of blacklisting, surveillance, compromising recordings, NDAs, and the use of substances to reduce resistance. This isn't random or opportunistic behavior. It's a sophisticated system designed to create victims who cannot escape or speak out. She continued, when Mr. Combs used phrases like consent is a contract and spoke about making people and having the power to break them, he was describing the fundamental dynamic of coercive control, creating a situation where victims feel they have no choice but to comply. Dr. Montgomery then outlined how such systems typically operate, pointing out specific elements from both the recording and previous testimony that illustrated each component. She explained how initial recruitment often involved legitimate opportunities and benefits, creating a sense of obligation and indebtedness. Victims are initially treated well, made to feel special and chosen. They receive gifts, opportunities, connections, things of real value, particularly to young people trying to establish themselves in a competitive industry. This creates both gratitude and dependency. She described how boundaries are then gradually eroded. The first compromising situation might seem like a misunderstanding or a one-time event. By the time victims realize the full extent of what's expected of them, they're already implicated or compromised in ways that make it difficult to refuse or report. The prosecutor displayed text messages from alleged victims that had been entered into evidence earlier in the trial. Dr. Montgomery, how would you characterize these communications? After reviewing the messages, which showed women attempting to decline invitations or express discomfort, followed by increasingly threatening responses, Dr. Montgomery explained, these show a pattern of what we call intermittent reinforcement, alternating between reward and punishment, praise and threat. This creates a powerful psychological dependency, where victims become focused on pleasing the controller to avoid punishment. She pointed to specific language in the messages. Notice how quickly the tone shifts from, "You're so special to me," to, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." And finally, to explicit threats about career consequences. This rapid cycling between positive and negative reinforcement is disorienting and makes it difficult for victims to maintain clear boundaries. The prosecutor then asked about the role of substances mentioned in the recording. Dr. Montgomery's response was direct. The deliberate use of alcohol and drugs, especially without full knowledge or consent, is a common tactic in trafficking and exploitation. It serves multiple purposes: reducing resistance, creating memory gaps, ensuring plausible deniability, and often making victims feel responsible for what happened to them. She continued, "When Mr. Combs referred to the right substances to make people more flexible, he was describing a deliberate strategy to compromise consent, something that is fundamentally incompatible with the concept of consent itself, which must be freely given by someone capable of making that choice." As Dr. Montgomery testified, her clinical language provided a framework for understanding the behaviors described throughout the trial. What might have appeared as isolated incidents or ambiguous interactions were revealed as elements of a comprehensive system of control and exploitation. The prosecutor then asked about the psychological impact on victims. Dr. Montgomery described how such systems create long-lasting trauma, often preventing victims from coming forward for years or even decades. When someone has been subjected to this kind of systematic control, particularly by a powerful and wealthy individual with extensive connections, the fear of speaking out is entirely rational. They've been shown repeatedly that resistance has consequences, that their words won't be believed, that the system is designed to protect the perpetrator rather than them. She explained how this related directly to the recording they had heard. When Mr. Combs said, "Who's going to believe them? Their word against mine?" he was articulating exactly why such systems persist. Victims know this reality. They've seen others try to speak out and be destroyed for it. The psychological burden of carrying such experiences without acknowledgement or justice is immense. Throughout this testimony, Diddy sat motionless, his earlier outburst apparently having exhausted his energy or been suppressed by his legal team's warnings. His attorneys took extensive notes, but seemed to struggle with how to cross-examine an expert whose analysis so perfectly aligned with their client's own recorded words. When cross-examination finally began, the defense attorney took a cautious approach, focusing on general questions about the reliability of memory and the possibility of consensual relationships that involve power differentials. Dr. Montgomery acknowledged these complexities but repeatedly returned to the specific language from the recording. When someone explicitly describes using substances to make people more flexible, preventing them from leaving events, and leveraging career opportunities as both reward and threat, we're no longer in the realm of ambiguous power dynamics, consensual relationships. We're describing a systematic approach to undermining meaningful consent. By the time Dr. Montgomery was excused from the witness stand, her testimony had provided a clinical framework that transformed how the jury understood both the recording and the previous victim testimony. What the defense had tried to portray as misunderstandings, regretted decisions, or transactional relationships had been recontextualized as elements of a sophisticated system of control and exploitation. In the gallery, several alleged victims, who had already testified, were visibly emotional, some holding hands or embracing, as they finally heard an expert articulate the dynamics they had struggled to explain. Reporters scribbled notes, already formulating headlines about Diddy's system of control and the architecture of silence. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Judge Tarnowski addressed both legal teams. "In light of today's evidence, we will reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss potential adjustments to the trial schedule and any motions either side wishes to file." She turned to the jury. "You are again instructed not to discuss this case with anyone, including each other, and to avoid any media coverage related to this trial." As the courtroom began to clear, the weight of the day's revelations hung in the air. The recording, authenticated and contextualized by expert testimony, had transformed the trial from a case of competing narratives to something far more definitive. Diddy's own words had confirmed what prosecutors had been arguing from the beginning. that the allegations weren't isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate, systematic operation that had functioned for decades. As Diddy was led from the courtroom by his legal team, he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the gaze of reporters, victims, and spectators alike. The man who had built an empire on his charismatic public image now seemed unable to face the public at all. The following morning, as court prepared to reconvene, the legal landscape had shifted dramatically. News of the recording had dominated headlines overnight, with legal analysts universally describing it as potentially case-ending evidence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled, with both supporters and protesters carrying signs and chanting. Security had been increased, creating a tense atmosphere even before proceedings began. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution team arrived early, quietly confident. The defense table remained empty until just minutes before the scheduled start, when Diddy entered flanked by his expanded legal team, now including 2 additional high-profile attorneys who had apparently been brought in overnight for crisis management. As Judge Tarnowski took the bench, she immediately addressed what many had already noticed. "I understand the defense wishes to make a statement before we proceed." Diddy's lead attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. After extensive consultation with our client, we would like to request a brief recess to discuss a potential resolution with the prosecution." A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge raised an eyebrow but maintained her composure. "Are you indicating that Mr. Combs wishes to change his plea?" "We're requesting time to discuss options with the prosecution, Your Honor." Judge Tarnowski turned to the prosecution table. "Does the government have a position on this request?" The lead prosecutor stood. "The government is always open to discussions, Your Honor, but given the stage of trial and the evidence presented thus far, any resolution would need to appropriately reflect the seriousness of the charges and the strength of our case." The judge considered for a moment. "I'll grant a 2-hour recess for these discussions. We will reconvene at 11:30. She turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, we have a procedural matter to address. You are excused until 11:30, with the usual admonitions about avoiding media coverage and not discussing the case." As the jury filed out, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters rushed from the room to break the news that plea negotiations appeared to be underway. Diddy conferred intensely with his legal team, his expression grim but resigned. When court reconvened, at 11:30 the tension was palpable. Judge Tarnowski called the court to order and addressed the attorneys. "Have the parties reached any agreement?" The lead prosecutor stood. "No, Your Honor. The government has made an offer that we believe appropriately reflects the seriousness of the charges and the evidence presented. The defense has rejected that offer." Diddy's attorney confirmed, "That's correct, Your Honor. The terms proposed by the government are unacceptable to our client. We are prepared to continue with trial." The judge nodded. "Very well. Please bring in the jury." As the jury returned to their seats, many glanced curiously at Diddy, perhaps wondering if they had missed a significant development. The prosecution called their next witness, Melissa Chen, a former assistant who had worked for Diddy from 2012 to 2017. Chen, a composed woman in her 30s, took the stand and was sworn in. After establishing her employment history, the prosecutor asked, "Ms. Chen, have you had an opportunity to listen to the recording that was played in court yesterday?" "Yes," she replied. "The FBI agents investigating this case played it for me about 6 months ago." "And what was your reaction to hearing that recording?" Chen took a deep breath. "Relief, initially. Relief that someone had managed to record one of those conversations, because so many of us had been told for years that no one would believe us without proof." "Can you elaborate on what you mean by those conversations?" Mr. Combs was very open with his inner circle about how he operated. The language in that recording, about consent being a contract, about having a system, about making and breaking people, I heard variations of those exact phrases dozens of times during my employment. The prosecutor displayed a series of emails on the courtroom screens. Ms. Chen, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 26. Can you identify these documents? Chen examined the emails. These are communications between myself and other members of Mr. Combs's staff regarding what were called special events at his various residences. And what was your role in relation to these special events? I handled logistics, guest lists, catering, security arrangements, transportation. I also was responsible for ensuring all guests signed NDAs before attending and for collecting phones and other recording devices. The prosecutor highlighted specific language in the emails. This message references the usual supplies. What did that mean? Chen's voice remained steady, but her discomfort was visible. That referred to various drugs, primarily MDMA, ketamine, and GHB, that were kept on hand at these events. There was also a reference to documentation supplies, which meant cameras and recording equipment that were set up in certain rooms. And what was the purpose of this recording equipment? Mr. Combs explained it to me as insurance, his word. He said everyone needed to have something on everyone else. That's how he maintained control and ensured loyalty. As Chen continued her testimony, she described a system nearly identical to what had been heard in the recording, a carefully orchestrated operation designed to compromise, control, and silence victims. She explained how staff were compartmentalized, with different teams handling different aspects of the operation, often without full knowledge of what others were doing. We were all implicated to some degree, she explained. Everyone had done something they could be blamed for if things went wrong. Everyone had something to lose if they spoke out. The prosecutor asked, "What made you decide to cooperate with the investigation?" Chen looked directly at Diddy for the first time. I stayed quiet for years after I left. I had signed multiple NDAs, and I was afraid of retaliation. But when I saw the video of Mr. Combs assaulting his former girlfriend in that hotel hallway, something broke inside me. That could have been any of us. That could have been me. She continued, I contacted an attorney who put me in touch with the FBI. I didn't know if they would believe me without evidence, but I had to try. I couldn't be part of the silence anymore. The prosecutor then asked about specific victims who had testified earlier in the trial. Chen confirmed witnessing interactions that corroborated their accounts, describing how young women who arrived at events excited about career opportunities would leave looking traumatized and disoriented. There was a pattern, she explained. They would be separated from any friends they came with, introduced to Mr. Combs in a private setting, encouraged to drink or take substances, and then things would happen that they hadn't agreed to. Afterward, they'd be offered gifts, opportunities, connections, the contract he talked about in the recording. Throughout this testimony, Diddy's demeanor continued to deteriorate. The confident, almost arrogant posture he had maintained through much of the trial was gone, replaced by a slumped posture and vacant stare. His attorneys repeatedly tried to engage him in whispered conversations, but he appeared disconnected, as if finally recognizing the inevitability of what was coming. During cross-examination, the defense tried to portray Chen as a disgruntled former employee with financial motives for testifying. She acknowledged being fired in 2017, but denied any financial incentive, pointing out that her cooperation had made her virtually unemployable in the entertainment industry. I knew what would happen when I came forward, she stated firmly. I've been blacklisted, threatened, and harassed. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while other women continued to be hurt by this system. As Chen stepped down from the witness stand, the cumulative impact of the recording and the corroborating testimony had created a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult for the defense to counter. The jury, many of whom had been taking extensive notes throughout, appeared visibly affected by what they had heard. The prosecution announced their next witness, Dr. James Wilson, a toxicologist who had analyzed samples from several alleged victims who had been tested within 24 hours of attending events at Diddy's residences. Dr. Wilson's testimony was clinical but devastating. He detailed finding GHB, ketamine, and MDMA in combinations that would cause disorientation, memory gaps, and increased suggestibility while leaving the victims conscious enough to physically participate in activities they might not otherwise consent to. These substances, particularly in combination, create a state where an individual may appear conscious and even responsive, but lacks the capacity for meaningful consent, he explained. Moreover, they cause anterograde amnesia, preventing the formation of new memories, which means victims may have only fragmentary recollections of what occurred. The prosecutor connected this testimony directly back to the recording, where Diddy had mentioned the right substances to make people more flexible. Dr. Wilson confirmed that the drugs found in the victims' systems would create precisely the state of compromised consent that Diddy had described. The judge called for a brief recess before the next witness. As the courtroom began to clear, Diddy remained seated, staring straight ahead, the weight of his own testimony visibly pressing down on him. The man who had once declared himself untouchable had just provided the final piece of evidence against himself. When Sean Diddy Combs stepped down from the witness stand, he didn't look like someone who had won anything. He looked like someone who had finally confronted the reality of his own actions. The courtroom remained unnaturally quiet, processing the unexpected turn of events. Even the judge looked slightly stunned by the effective confession they had just witnessed. Some of the jurors had tears in there, but outside the courtroom, the world was only beginning to react. The music industry went into full crisis mode. Record labels issued statements distancing themselves from Diddy and announcing reviews of harassment policies. Artists who had collaborated with him over decades scrambled to express shock and condemnation. Associates who had once benefited from his power and influence now claimed they had always had concerns about his behavior. Behind closed doors, crisis meetings were convened at entertainment companies across Los Angeles and New York. PR firms circulated guidance on how clients should respond to questions about their relationships with Diddy. And while many tried to pretend they were blindsided by the revelations, the internet was already connecting dots that had been visible for years. Old tour interviews resurfaced showing industry insiders joking about Diddy's parties with knowing looks. Photos of visibly uncomfortable women at his events circulated with new context. And most painfully, previous accusations that had been dismissed as extortion attempts were being re-examined with new credibility. Fans weren't just shocked. They were furious. Furious that someone they had admired had abused his power so systematically. Furious that the industry had protected him for decades. And furious that it had taken this long for victims to be believed. The era of impunity was over. The next morning, a palpable shift had occurred in the courtroom. News outlets were reporting that sources close to the defense team said Diddy was considering changing his plea. Legal analysts speculated that the recording had made a successful defense virtually impossible. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lined up outside hoping for a seat. As Judge Tarnowski took the bench, she addressed an immediate matter. "I understand the defense has a motion to present before we continue with testimony." Diddy's lead attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. After consultation with our client, We are requesting permission for Mr. Combs to address the court directly. The request was unusual at this stage of a trial. The prosecutor objected immediately. Your Honor, if the defendant wishes to speak, the proper procedure is to take the witness stand where he can be cross-examined. This appears to be an attempt to communicate with the jury without subjecting himself to questioning. Judge Tarnowski considered the request carefully. What is the specific purpose of Mr. Combs's proposed statement? Your Honor, my client wishes to respond to the recording that was played for the jury and provide necessary context that he believes is missing. The judge turned to Diddy. Mr. Combs, are you prepared to take the witness stand and be subject to cross-examination regarding your statement and all other matters relevant to this case? A tense silence filled the courtroom as Diddy conferred briefly with his attorneys. Finally, he stood. Yes, Your Honor, I'll take the stand. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Until this moment, it had been widely assumed that Diddy would not testify, a standard strategy in criminal cases where the defendant's testimony risks creating additional vulnerability. His decision to take the stand signaled either a desperate gamble or a recognition that the case was already lost. After being sworn in, Diddy took the witness stand. Gone was the designer suit and confident demeanor that had characterized his court appearances. Instead, he wore a simple navy suit, his posture humbled, his voice subdued. His attorney began with a simple question. Mr. Combs, we've all heard the recording that was played in court. What context do you believe is missing from that conversation? Diddy cleared his throat. First, I want to acknowledge that my words on that recording are indefensible. There's no context that makes them acceptable. I was arrogant, callous, and wrong. The courtroom stirred at this unexpected opening. His attorney seemed momentarily thrown, but recovered. Can you explain to the jury what state of mind you were in during that conversation? I was intoxicated, Diddy replied, not just with alcohol and drugs, but with power. I've spent decades surrounded by people who catered to my every whim, who told me I was untouchable, who cleaned up my messes. I started to believe I was above the rules that apply to everyone else. His attorney guided him through questions about his career, his rise to fame, and the music empire he had built. Diddy spoke about growing up without a father, about his drive to succeed, about the legitimate aspects of his business ventures. But rather than presenting these as justifications, he repeatedly returned to the theme of how success had corrupted him. I confused power with the right to exercise that power over others, he said at one point. I told myself that everyone benefited from their association with me, that it was a fair exchange. I refused to see the harm I was causing. When asked directly about the allegations of sex trafficking and racketeering, Diddy's response was carefully crafted, but damning nonetheless. I created a culture where lines were constantly crossed, where consent was compromised, where silence was purchased. I didn't call it trafficking or racketeering. I called it business. I called it parties. I called it networking. But labels don't change what it was. His attorney, seemingly navigating unfamiliar territory with a client who was not following the expected defense strategy, asked about specific victims who had testified. I don't dispute their accounts, Diddy responded. For years, I told myself that their experiences were different than how they remembered them. That recording showed exactly how I rationalized my behavior, by convincing myself that power and opportunity were fair trades for the things I demanded. As direct examination continued, it became increasingly clear that Diddy was not mounting a traditional defense, but instead offering what appeared to be a confession wrapped in context and personal history. Whether this was a strategic attempt to mitigate sentencing or a genuine moment of reckoning remained unclear. The real test came when cross-examination began. The lead prosecutor approached the witness stand with a thick binder of evidence. "Mr. Combs, you've presented yourself today as someone who has had a revelation about your past behavior. Is that an accurate characterization?" "Yes," Diddy replied. "And when exactly did this revelation occur? Was it perhaps yesterday, after the jury heard you in your own words describing a system of exploitation and control? After your own former employees corroborated everything in that recording?" "It's been a process," Diddy replied, his composure slipping slightly. "But yes, hearing that recording played in court was clarifying. Hearing myself say those things, seeing the reactions of the jury, the public, even my own family, I couldn't hide from it anymore." The prosecutor nodded. "So, not during the decades you were engaging in this behavior. Not when victims came forward with lawsuits. Not when you were arrested and charged. But yesterday, when you realized the jury had heard irrefutable evidence of your guilt." "Objection!" Diddy's attorney called out. "Argumentative." "Sustained," the judge ruled. "Rephrase, counsel." The prosecutor adjusted her approach, but continued to press Diddy on the timing and sincerity of his apparent remorse. She walked him through specific allegations from victims, asking him to confirm or deny each one. Diddy largely confirmed the accounts, occasionally adding that his memory of events was compromised by his own substance use at the time. The most powerful moment came when the prosecutor asked about a specific line from the recording. "And who's going to believe them? Their word against mine?" "You said that, correct?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Diddy admitted. "And that sentiment, that no one would believe your victims because of your power, wealth, and influence, that was central to how you operated for decades, wasn't it?" Diddy paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes. So all those women who came forward over the years, who were dismissed as gold diggers, as opportunists, as liars, you knew they were telling the truth, didn't you?" "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying." "I'll rephrase," the prosecutor said before the judge could rule. "Mr. Combs, when previous accusers came forward with stories similar to what we've heard in this trial, did you know they were telling the truth about their experiences?" Diddy looked down at his hands. "Yes." "And did you participate in efforts to discredit them? To portray them as liars seeking money?" "Yes." "Did you authorize payments to silence them?" "Yes." "Did you threaten their careers if they didn't accept those payments and sign NDAs?" "In some cases, yes." As cross-examination continued, Diddy's initial composure gradually eroded. The prosecutor methodically walked him through the elements of each criminal charge, effectively extracting admissions that aligned with the legal definitions of sex trafficking, racketeering, and the other counts he faced. By the time cross-examination concluded, Diddy appeared exhausted and defeated. His testimony, rather than providing the context he had hoped might mitigate the damage from the recording, had instead cemented the prosecution's case in many respects. As a bequeath, he stepped down from the witness stand. He paused, looking out at the courtroom filled with reporters, victims, curious spectators, and his own family members. For a moment, it seemed he might make an additional statement, but instead, he simply returned to the defense table in silence. Eyes. And Diddy, for the first time since his arrest, looked like a man who had accepted that the end had come. Diddy didn't speak to his attorneys when he returned to the defense table. He didn't write notes, didn't whisper strategies. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand he had just vacated, as if still seeing the ghost of his former self there, the man who had believed in his own impunity. When asked later by reporters if Diddy's testimony had been a strategic move, his lead attorney reportedly responded, "Sometimes the truth is the only strategy left." When court reconvened the following day, the defense team made a stunning announcement. Diddy wished to change his plea to guilty on all counts. The prosecution, after consultation with victims, agreed to the plea change, but made it clear they would be seeking the maximum sentences allowed by law. Judge Tarnowski addressed Diddy directly, conducting a thorough plea colloquy to ensure he understood the rights he was waiving and the potential sentences he faced. When asked if anyone had coerced him into changing his plea, Diddy shook his head. "No, Your Honor. I'm pleading guilty because I am guilty. I've caused tremendous harm to many people over many years. I can't change that, but I can at least acknowledge it and accept the consequences." The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, remanding Diddy to custody pending that hearing. As he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, several of his victims who had testified during the trial watched in silence, some holding hands, others wiping away tears. The man who had seemed untouchable was finally facing justice. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions extended far beyond Diddy himself. Multiple investigations were launched into industry practices that had enabled such behavior. Other powerful figures in entertainment faced renewed scrutiny about their own conduct. Victims of similar abuse in the industry began coming forward in unprecedented numbers, many citing the Diddy case as giving them the courage to speak. The recording that had broken the case open, those 9 minutes of unguarded conversation that had shattered Diddy's carefully constructed defense, became the centerpiece of documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies on power, abuse, and accountability in the entertainment industry. At the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, several victims delivered powerful impact statements. One woman, who had first encountered Diddy as an aspiring singer when she was just 19, addressed him directly. "You stole my dreams, my confidence, and years of my life. But today, watching you face consequences that your money and fame couldn't prevent, that gives me back something you took. It gives me hope that things can change." Diddy was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison on the most serious charges, with additional sentences to run concurrently. As the judge delivered the sentence, she noted, "The harm you caused was not accidental or isolated. By your own admission, it was systematic, deliberate, and sustained over decades." The sentence reflects not just the gravity of the crimes, but the scope and duration of the damage inflicted. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time, Diddy looked nothing like the music mogul who had once graced magazine covers and commanded industry respect. He looked like what the court had determined he was, a criminal who had used his power to victimize others for decades, now finally held accountable. Outside the courthouse, one of the lead prosecutors made a brief statement. "Today's outcome sends a message that should have been clear all along. No one is above the law. No amount of money, fame, or power places you beyond accountability. And no victim's voice is too small to be heard." The case would go on to inspire significant legal and cultural changes. California and New York passed laws limiting the scope of non-disclosure agreements in cases involving alleged sexual misconduct. The recording industry established new oversight mechanisms and support systems for young artists. Victims' advocacy groups reported unprecedented levels of outreach from people in entertainment and other industries dominated by powerful gatekeepers. But perhaps the most profound impact was simpler. It showed that even decades of silence could eventually be broken by the truth. Captured in 9 minutes of unguarded conversation, where a powerful man revealed who he really was. If you found this story informative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you in-depth coverage of important stories that others might miss. Your support helps us continue this work. Thanks for watching.